Ethan, how are you, Ethan? It's so good to see you. How are you doing today?
Doing well. How are you, sir?
I am doing well, Michael. It's good to see you. Your email and support of belonging again has meant the world, Ethan. I'm glad you've enjoyed it so much. Thank you for all your thoughts.
You're welcome, man. It's been an amazing read and I got it right here, still diving in. But yeah, there's a lot of good ideas and yeah, really excited to dive deeper and discuss it with you at some point.
Well, that means the
But
world.
thank you
I'd be
so
much, and Clayton, good to see you. And thank you so much for checking out Belonging again. I'd be curious any thoughts you have or anything at all, and then in general for anyone, I'd be curious about. But I'll throw it to you to start if you have any thoughts or anything, Ethan, and then throw it to Luber here.
I love it. I love it. I came here to participate, that's for sure. Um yeah, I think I might have sent it in the email a little bit, but I kind of had this like my world kind of collapsed a bit, left a relationship, left a city. And so the kind of concept of givens and the loss of the givens was really made a lot of sense. And that it's like, okay, I've never fully felt at home in a worldview. Like I've tried on so many different worldviews. I've never quite felt at home in them. This idea that like I'd never had like a fully given worldview or that's if that's even possible today. And I've been grappling with like how like a lot of I've been very much drawn towards epistemological questions lately of how do I know what is true? And I think for a while I was very much this might go to your other book, Conflicts of Mind, I think it's
Yeah.
called. But I've always kind of had this very spiritual Buddhist, like the non-rational subjective is how I can know what is true. And then after reading a bit of Ayn Rand and like seeing like her case for like rationality and reason as her epistemology, now I'm kind of holding the two. And it very much is kind of disorienting to not have a ground to stand on epistemologically. And so it seems like belonging again speaks to that a lot and speaks to, this. I think there was one point about uh what was it? Some sort of Hume idea about thoughtlessness versus bad philosophy versus good philosophy or something like that. And Yeah, and I'm just trying to figure out like what is good philosophy, what does it look like to hold all of these different worldviews and to sit in the, as you call it, like existential anxiety of it. And almost like I kind of have had this gut sense, but you kind of affirmed it that like perhaps that's a good thing. Perhaps it's actually good to, or it's good to put that as like the existential anxiety shouldn't be interpreted as a bad thing. It's actually just a feature of doing philosophy, and that has been kind of an interesting perspective. So I'll stop there. I kind of just threw a bunch out there, but
That is
that's where
magnificent.
I've been at.
I appreciate it. Daniel, good to see you. And again, it's wonderful to see you and thank you for being here. And if you ever happen toward Virginia, as everyone here knows, dinner is usually about 5. Just come on by. We actually have a fire pit now. Mr. Luber, next time you're here,
Amazing.
Luber, we have a fire pit. We did s'mores on Christmas Eve and I didn't blow up. It was pretty great.
That's
And actually, I'll tell you what, when you hook up that propane tank for the first time and you turn it on and you go to hit that button, there is a moment where you go, I don't know that this works. This is the first time. And you go, and you just poke it. And then it turns on. You go, oh, God, that would have been an awkward Christmas. That would have been an awkward Christmas. So we have s'mores now. But no, every time you say, absolutely. So much of the tension of belonging again feeds directly into the questions of, okay, well, if it turns out fault is not in the business actually of simply deconstructing givens, because that makes freedom not feel free and overwhelms us, and yet that is a true advancement. There is a true advancement in givens being freed, of thought being freed from givens, because otherwise you get closed-mindedness, you get Hannah Arendt's banality of evil. That's a real advancement. But now freedom and thought are in a pickle because we can't have belonging, and I would argue you can't have an anti-fragile meaning that is open to the other without something like belonging, which in all of history has required givens. And once you leave givens, you can't go back to givens because they're no longer given. Ladies and gentlemen, we have a pickle. We have a pickle. We have the pickle of the age, and it is. I don't think it has been properly absorbed in political science. I think the entire discourse in general is behind the times. And what you kind of see is basically a back and forth. If you watch the news or you listen to the politicians or look at the economy, there's just this kind of what Hegel may say a kind of just back and forth between two different sides that never actually go anywhere. They seem like they're going anywhere because generally in America, if you move from left to right, you say, "Oh, that's movement." No, it isn't. It's still within the frame, right? So it's an appearance of movement, but it's on the side of what Hegel may call understanding, not speculative, like speculative thinking, which is actually where you're thinking, "Hey, if these two sides are actually two sides of the same thing, then what would be an alternative to this whole? Because that's really hard to think. Like we haven't had to thought what would be a new kind of given that affords a belonging again, a new kind of belonging that creates something like givenness, but is not identical to givenness. And that seems to be an impossibility, but that's what we have a lot of fun thinking about here on the net. And Luber talks about theme, and we have all sorts of good times talking about things. And so it's a real challenge. It does also radically transform. Basically, I'm of the opinion, and I do think I've mentioned Hegel, but I think Hegel gets this, and I think Hume was pointing to this, is you take all this problem seriously, you will have to have a serious reconsideration of logic, of ontoepistemology, on politics, and all of that, which sounds like, well, don't people do that in history and it ruins everything? People have their great ideas and they force a society to conform and we all die. So is that what we're saying here? Well, we can't say that. And yet at the same time, some kind of sublation, some sort of transformation is needed. Oh, in history, as you mentioned Austrian economics, Hayek makes it very clear that you can't violate the organic processes of the society without destroying everything. So we were talking last week, here's the question. How do you change the world for the better without being a dictator? Or without ignoring complexity, without unintentional consequences? How do you transform the world without being a savior? Here's the key, without knowing the right way for the world to change the world. Well, isn't that counterintuitive? I mean, why would you change the world for the better if you're not going to have an idea of what constitutes better? Isn't that contradictory? Well, that's what we have to do. And that's what everything becomes about: social coordination and girdle points and problems of internal consistency and lack and beauty and all sorts of stuff. So it's a big deal. And I really appreciate everything you thought through. And I do think it is, and I'll throw it to Luber here. And if anyone else wants to speak, just raise your hand at any point. It is very pressing. But I think it is necessary. And I actually think the work of doing it isn't simply for an abstract social order, but it has big implications for your personal life, in your relationships, in your marriages, for your ability to experience beauty. The kind of philosophy I think that we need in this moment precisely actually unveils that what is, I suppose, best on the larger scale is precisely what is best in the home. That actually evidence that you have the right kind of philosophy. If your marriage is not good, if you don't have friends, then your philosophy is wrong. And that actually is the correct sort of pragmatic test that I think we've been missing. You know, people like Richard Rorty and everyone was like, well, if your idea can't be tested and it's not practical, then that's kind of evidence that it's false. And people like Hume, and I can go more into the bad, the thoughtless, and the good philosophy of Hume. But very often, I think we've tested ideas based on their utility, right? On are they practical? But the kind of ideas we're talking about is, do they bring out your relationships? Do you actually see beauty in your spouse? Are you actually able to, with your friends, have conversation that makes time speed up and you don't even notice? Are you able to create spaces that when you enter into, you feel some sort of fullness of being? Because that actually is a practical test. We've just not thought about it as practical because we've defined practical overly framed within the logic of utility. But if we're talking a certain phenomenological pragmatism, according to beauty, then actually there is a very real test here. But we have to change our parameters of what we think are how a test is done. But that work can be done, and that work is real. And I think also it can be tied to the question of, can we tell a good story, which means we have to know what a story is, which means we have to know what a theme is, which brings us to Mr. Luber. Mr. Luber, let me throw it to you. I'll throw it to Luber, Nelson, and then Michael here. Mr. Luber, good to see you, sir.
The great maestro, Daniel.
You're a gentleman.
Literally, it's like I'm hearing all these different philosophies, all these different thoughts, and I actually see a connection to everything. And that's the byproduct of all the thoughts, but like it's why they're so big, and like it's like it's like where's the cutoff? Because you could literally, I feel like everything you'll hear, every new thing you'll hear, you'll be able to absorb it into the like already existing connectivity in which you're seeing. And like that's like the cool thing about your project, which is like you kind of see an end in a certain sense, but like it's not crystal clear because, well, that because can open a can of worms. Like I have thoughts, and this isn't related to the thoughts, but it's just because I'll just say you keep encountering new things and the world keeps changing and you have to keep adding to that connectivity because of those two things, basically. But um I'll just a couple respond. Ethan, it sounds like you're living a story right now. So I would like be really excited because it's like it's scary but exciting. Like like it's how I feel living in LA. Like I don't feel at home. I feel out of, a fish out of water all the time. And it's like really hard and tiresome because like emotionally and mentally tiresome because it's you're I'm constantly on the move, it feels like because I'm the fish out of water, trying to get back to water somehow. But what else? Before I get into the thoughts, because I came into this net session kind of hot with a lot of thoughts, because I've been listening to the other ones. I've been talking to Javier a lot because he's been reading. He just read Zupanch's Ethics of the Real. He just finished a couple of Lacan seminars, and he's like trying to understand their relationship to theme. And we've been I haven't talked about theme this much in such an explicit way since maybe when we were like writing the book, Daniel, kind of thing. So it's great. It's really great. And then Jockin and I have been reading Heidegger's the Kant metaphysics, where it's incredible how much he talks about theme. It's actually like unreal. And I actually can see. I'll get to that in a sec. But first, I think we are too pragmatic under utility to kind of talk about that point. That will get resolved with AI. I think utility will become, because it makes sense that we were pragmatic for utility purposes, considering it was like the vibes were survival of the fittest because it felt like nature was constantly fucking us. Otherwise, we needed to take some control of nature, otherwise we would get extinct. That's kind of like the general gist. And it seems like we're now at this turning point where that doesn't seem to be a given, like kind of to your work. The given, you can't go back once you kind of move past it. And yeah, obviously, I do want to relate this to the causer and all this stuff, but like one thing at a time. So I think because we've been operating under this like epoch for a very long time of we understand essentially friendship under the guise of pragmatic utility. I'm friends with my coworker. I'm friends with my like you're friends with things that are necessary for you to have um a more efficient life. And like that was a defense against getting extinct, is how I see it. Because everybody that is connected to you relationship wise, everyone's in the same boat of like, well, if one of them gets extinct, then I could get extinct. So it's kind of like a group resistance to getting extinct, is how I see it. Um, so I do think that's going to change, and I think like this is just kind of like like what we're doing is like almost like the preliminary phases of what life would look like 100 years from now, when that dynamic of what constitutes a relationship isn't the force function of causing this type of dynamic. It's going to be um like like Javier said to me, it's like because I love Lacan and stuff, but I just like to me it's like they're just operating under pathology and the symptomatic thing. Like, how do you know how to act at the end of the day? Like, it's not actually helping you to like actually in my head like live a story. Like, it'll help you point out like how you need to, but not necessarily how to do it. And like that's you know in their mind hysteric. So ba- ba- basically there's a real tension at play there, and like Javier's like I feel that tension. It's not like I don't disagree with you or anything. It's like I feel it, and like we have to like kind of we need each other to actually um let that blossom and make itself become transparent. And that's what this friendship, like my friendship with, like I'll speak for me and Daniel, like my friendship with Daniel is like I'm like I'm like writing this book, I'm doing research, I'm like there's this real fucking tension that's like driving me nuts. And then I like find this guy who's like posting stuff and talking about it. It's like, wait a second, he's also like carrying with this tension here. So it's like I gravitate toward him because it's like I need him. I need this like connective tissue to help fight against this tension. And it is very analogous to the paradigm of friendship relationships being necessary, being not sorry, friendships, relationships under this pragmatic utilitarian guise, where it's like I need my coworkers in order to survive. I need my friendships in that efficient mode, coworker, neighbor, et cetera, and so forth. Because if I don't, I might not survive. Like I might become extinct. So what's interesting here is that the tension that I think I kind of am like almost like tennis chain holding with Daniel and like Javier and like Jockin and so many others. I'm just like, this is just naming a couple. And it's like, if I don't hold on to this tennis chain with them, I might not survive like on a different way, in a completely different way. Like it's the, the stakes aren't immediacy. It's not like, oh, I'm not going to be able to get food or sick or like those kind of things that the pragmatic utilitarian paradigm had to focus on, which is sickness, just money, getting those resources. This is like what it means to be human is at stake. And like that was always implicit, subsumed in the utilitarian paradigm, but it wasn't brought to the forefront precisely because there was nothing externally causing it to do that. Yeah, it was in the underbelly because we were too concerned with the immediacy issues, as we should be. Like it would make sense to be concerned with the immediacy, but it's like how I get food on the table, how I stay healthy has almost nothing to do with Daniel, Jockin, and Javier in a certain sense. Like maybe you can make a case for mental health with friendship, and like that's a little bit of a tangent, but um, I just wanted to make that point that there is an analogous position of survival, you could say, um, but it's survival in a different way. It's survival in a completely different way, and I think what it means to be human is not what was at stake 300 years ago, even though you would think it would be because it's like, oh, you had the Enlightenment and they're trying to figure out rights, human rights. Well, the whole thing with human rights was how can everybody get their uh, call it the pragmatic utilitarian need in the most efficient way? It was how do we understand humans so we can fulfill this immediacy, not like it would be almost obscure to talk about it without that immediacy. Essentially, back in those days, it's like people would be like, "Who gives a shit if it's not actually helping me like organize a state such that I can get property, food, like it's a different plane." Anyway, I digress with that point. Um, so the other point that I want to respond to is I completely agree with like how do we make the world a better place without ignoring the complexity, without thinking, you know what's best and kind of dictating it into the world. And I want to say I agree with like how the home is very isomorphic to the state in that sense. I want to start with talking about how every home is different. And this is where I want to talk about theme because I really think this is like um, a really good way to approach difference. And um, every home has their own respective theme in which constitutes all possible comportments of what a home can do. And I think the name of the game is to recognize that there is some theme that is dictating these different comportments, but you're not exactly sure what the theme is. You're never like positive what the theme is. Like this is where I'm a little Kantian with it. There has this you never know, and that's what kind of causes like the not that to keep pushing and progressing the homes at any possible mode the home is being. So once you kind of realize that there's something you're kind of trying to scaffold, so to speak, and follow, you then realize, wait a second, all the other homes are also doing that too. But they're different. They're just different by virtue of it's not me, you know? So it's just like it's like your address is just different. Like you could put it like that. So when you realize that other people are trying to, also scaffold that out, then there's right away more room for forgiveness in my mind. And the reason why that's the case is because you would be able, if you talk to them or live with them, like you'd be able to discern whether the other person is being thematic or not, in the sense that if my home is saying, okay, well, Daniel's home can't have eggs, something crazy and stupid. It's like how on earth does that relate to me scaffolding my own theme? Like it has nothing to do with that. So like an analogous situation that comes up here is the AI when you take a picture and people are like causing the girls to like have bigger tits and shit from AI, right? Oh, well, you're not doing it with my consent. You're making me feel more alienated from myself. Well, the thing is, it's like to think thematically, you're only concerned with things when enjoyment meets action, not enjoyment that's castrated from action. So like when you do if I did like if someone like took a picture of my face right now and then AI did and made it look like the most like greedy Jewish looking thing for comedy purposes, that could be that's funny to me. But like why would I like care about it in a way it's existentially threatening to me because it's not a real action. It's not real. It has nothing it's not actually in my world. Like it constitutes no stakes. It literally constitutes no stakes. The second it constitutes stakes in my world, then it's in the thematic inquiry. So I think a big problem with how to understand how to best make the world a better place is to understand what to really care about. That's the key. Clear example of like people caring about things that aren't actually modes of being in the world at all. And like AI, which is awesome, honestly, they allow human beings to see what to really care about in a more clear way because they can generate things that actually have no mode of being in the world. Like I can enjoy my enjoyment without actually doing any actions, like doing anything with any stakes, which makes it so clear on what to care about if I'm a human being. It's like brilliant. It's absolutely brilliant. Like I'm so pro do whatever the fuck you want with AI pictures because it's like, who cares? Who cares? As long as I'm not actually doing the action, as long as it doesn't cause me to do the action or someone else to do it. The other thing is that I kind of wanted to talk about is basically the ethics of drive and the ethics of desire. And basically, when you're not operating under a symptomatic position, you're basically your drive and enjoyment are your drive is dictating your what you are enjoying, and your enjoyment, which is based off the drive, is dictating the actual actions you're doing. That is right there the formula for not being a symptomatic individual. That to me is when you're like actually operating in a story, so to speak. And like typically when that happens, it's because there's these real constraints that emerge that force you to have to do that. Like there's a force function to it too. Like you don't just like choose it. Like I didn't choose to be obsessed with storytelling. Like it just fucking happened because of, and I can go through like different historicities in my life that essentially could have done that, but like for this conversation, who cares? Um, so yeah, I mean, I have so much more to say, but I have it written down, and maybe I'll return. I've just been talking for too long, so
No, I think everything you're getting at is extremely important. And Aspasia, wonderful to see you. There's a bunch of things. So first off, the moral real is always the challenge of global pluralism. We talk all day about differences. The real differences that actually count, that are the challenge of pluralism, are the moral differences, right? And that is what we do not have a political science to think, right? Because yeah, there are some people that say, well, if it's just AI, what does it matter? And then other people say, no, it matters very much if it's my kid. And so then they're going to pass laws, and once you pass laws, then you have some states that say this, and we get a civil war, right? Because you get a split, right? Because some people now, because there's also something you're pointing out as well, because there's also an issue where, if somebody says, well, it's okay as long as it's not a kid that resembles mine, right? Well, it's not real, right? So then you get all of these sort of the ethical real, the moral real is always where all of the challenges begin. The civil wars, the countries falling apart. And what ends up happening is once you remove givens, you unleash differences in moral terms. I think eating animals is murder. You do not. I think that we need to invade your country to stop you from murdering animals. You think that's invasive. I think it's a moral revolution. Who decides what and according to what terms, right? And if we're not able to think about moral differences according to the problem of internally consistent systems or how to handle those differences, then we're in massive trouble. But to the idea that AI also in its massive creation sort of unveils in its sort of Alex Ebert saturation what we actually care about or what we should care about, I actually think is getting at something that's very, very important, because we often don't see the thing that we're actually toward through the thing that we're looking at, right? That there's actually kind of a deeper level in operation. I think you were pointing at that with the efficiency issue as well, because there's a funny way in which if you have friends that you don't feel like you're doing any kind of work with, it can be boring or small talk. You want to have a kind of feeling that we're working on something together. But then there's also a deep problem with working with someone if they are reduced to their function to the degree they help with that work, right? And there's a problem there, right? So the question is this, because there's also something on this top-down operation, like what is the necessity that can be a unifying principle across difference that is not going to top-down squash difference into conformity, if you will, right? Because a given is a kind of necessity. And basically in history, we were able to create necessities that bound difference by givenness, by not thinking about it. You were just born in a Christian society. So the necessity is that you go to church. The necessity is you believe in God, and it's a necessity. So much so that it's in a sense not even a necessity, it's just isness, right? It's just the way that one does things. And that this necessity allows difference, but not so much difference it becomes chaos, right? Because difference is a problem when it removes social intelligibility, right? Like as long as there could be lots of difference as long as it does not threaten the way that we understand ourselves and one another, and it becomes that which I cannot understand, right? And so givens could bind diversity within a certain range so that it did not become chaos, right? But of course, that nevertheless put bindings on what people could be and would have to oppress people. And then we go through the history, xenophobia, racism, all of these other things, right? But nevertheless, you need some kind of necessity in order to kind of hold people together. Otherwise, you end up in certain troubles. Well, the question becomes, what is the necessity? Well, first off, it would seem, and then I'll throw it to Ethan and Michael here. And Ethan, you can talk about anything at all, and whatever you were originally thinking, there is no requirement at all. We actually enjoy very much when people bring up different things or from earlier in the conversation, because everything kind of weaves together and it's a lot of fun. So we enjoy that. There's a way in which efficiency is tied to not wanting to waste time, right? Or just start dancing. Aspasia is correct. Like, you don't want to waste time, right? There's a way in which AI, it's not that the paradigm of efficiency is wrong. It's that it has a historic necessity that if you continue to ascribe to in the future, you're overfitting it, right? And therefore, it needs to be brought into its fullness, right? So if efficiency is strongly tied to not wanting to waste time, well, why not waste time, right? Like, why not? That's just a negative, right? Well, it turns out that what we actually long for is the fulfillment of time, for a flow, for a quality of experience where you feel like time is really, really alive, right? And as AI saturates efficiency in terms of tasks, it creates an opening of actually turning out, the whole time that you were focused on utilitarianism, it was to get to the place where you focus on flow, where you focus on full attention, the fullness of time, where time has a certain life to it otherwise would not. And you had to go through the utilitarian paradigm in order to get to that place where you would have the opportunity to realize that. But precisely because you went through that paradigm, you could lose sight of that deeper principle that was latent that you were trying to bring out. And you get habituated out of the ability to even think according to efficiency in a more fulfilled way, because as sociology teaches us, we're trained by our habits and our historic paradigms, right? So this is what Hegel would point out. The necessity is that we have to misunderstand to understand. We have to necessarily misunderstand what it is we're after in order to take a step that we need to fully see what it was that we were looking for, right? And there's a kind of necessity in that, actually. You have to get it you have to, in a sense, get it wrong to get it right. You have to get it through history incomplete in order to advance. And the question is, if that's a necessary movement of history, which makes sense because thought is temporal and it has to develop temporally, like it has to take one, you can't skip the step of utilitarianism. You can't skip that. You can't skip that emphasis on efficiency. Otherwise, you evolutionarily die. Otherwise, you don't make it to where you make an internet that can do AI to take care of all your manual tasks so you can focus on something else, right? So you have to go through that paradigm. You can't skip that step. And yet, if you stay on that step, you end up in trouble, right? Like, you have to actually then sublate it, bring it into a fullness of time paradigm, right? And there's a certain historic givenness in that, a certain a givenness in time versus in state of a social order, right? In development, in a certain process. And the question becomes, to what degree can an understanding of that structure make people adequately open in their difference to one another, to meet one another, without leading into chaos or anything, right? Like, to have that adequate openness. Well, if you understand that error becomes necessary for truth, that at least creates room. You've already said it makes room for forgiveness, makes room for humility, makes room for listening, makes room for understanding. And Mr. Jockin, good to see you, sir. It makes one understand that the point of democracy is not powering over your view on the other side, but actually the metaxis, as Desmond may say, the between. But here's the other trick. Everything we're describing, and I'll throw it to Mr. Nelson here, everything we're describing, though, occupies this sort of strange spot between non-rationality and rationality, between seeing the limits of rationality and also the necessity of rationality. The ability to reason well, but not also have your reasoning make you incapable of seeing the value of that which cannot be easily quantified, say, according to quality. You need the ability to think through, but not lose the ability to apprehend, say, the thing, and to be able to reason from the thing. So there is a certain mode of thinking that is not easily articulate purely in non-rational or purely rational terms, that education needs to be reformed to incubate, philosophy needs to be structured to understand, and we need to have a certain trust in, of which if we cannot do, it is doubtful we will be the kind of subjects and people of whom will meet the occasion of the new address that our political, sociological, and economic situation calls for. There's more to be said. I think also what you're pointing to the ethical real that we pointed to is actually massive. I think that is such a massive issue and it is underappreciated. Also, I think the things on you're saying on ethics of drive and desire matter, but I will pause and I will throw it to Mr. Nelson and then Michael and anyone else who would like to speak. Mr. Nelson, please.
Thanks. My head is spinning. It's like I got to do some like philosophical curls or something because I'm not used to this level of thinking. Yeah, so where do I start? I want to start with something that Andrew was talking about. And yeah, there's a couple things I want to touch on, but the friendship point I think is really fascinating to me. I've been thinking about this a lot. First, Daniel, you said something around how the home or the family or the friendship is kind of like an arbiter of how effective your philosophy is or the philosophy that you're doing. And that makes a lot of sense to me, but then it also like kind of hit me hard because I'm at the place where in trying to like seek truth, I actually ostracize myself from a lot of people that I was in relationship with. And so like is this like maybe it's like a long-term process, right? Where is there you talking about kind of friendships of survival versus kind of like philosophical friendships is how I heard it. And it sounds like potentially you need to have both. What I was hearing is potentially like we still somewhat live in a survival world, and like having kind of survival based friendships is still very like you can't entirely throw that out the window. But now we kind of have this new opportunity to have these philosophical friendships. Um, but yeah, I guess the question that I'm asking myself is like if I was in a relationship with a lot of people that there's like a very deeply constricted worldview, and it's kind of everywhere. It's hard to kind of escape that. But my experience, my individual experience over the last like 12 months or so has been that and this is kind of what Daniel talked about in belonging again, with skepticism is not the same as disagreement, or critical thinking and disagreement are not the same. Where it's like it was really difficult for me to navigate in that I'm trying to think critically, but in doing so, I tend to end up in these heated conversations where I'm being mistaken as disagreeing something that someone holds as fundamental. And so it's like, how do I both seek truth without ostracizing everyone that's close to me? Or is it just a matter of finding a pocket of people who do have that capacity and then confining my deeper conversations to that group of people that can hold that capacity, and then not bringing it up at with the more survival based friendships or friendships of close proximity essentially. So that's something that I was thinking about, because I kind of noticed like I was in these communities and I was like so desiring this philosophical friendship, this desire to like just like hash ideas out and not know what is true, and just be in that kind of like existential anguish of it all, of just like I don't want to deconstruct everything, but it's too soon to reconstruct something. So I'm in this like weird middle where I desire to have this like constructed worldview that makes sense, but also like there's still a process of everything not making sense and deconstructing that. Maybe it's both at the same time. I don't know. Um, but yeah, like how do you feel a sense of belonging with people if when you try to think critically you become ostracized from them? Maybe that's what the question is like how do you feel that sense of belonging, or a belonging in the world where there is so much lack of intelligibility, shared intelligibility, everywhere that you turn, no matter where you live. Like I was thinking about it like, okay, where do I want to live next? And there's a question of like, can I find a place where there's like more political diversity, or there's more like, because I was in a place where there was very low political diversity. Everything was hyper left, hyper liberal. And it's like, I don't want to like just push off from that and just now all of a sudden just be on the opposite camp. But yet being in that thing seemed to, in that like space seemed to ostracize me because of my desire to just like have these, like, I don't know what my worldview is, but I'm just trying to figure it out. And like, like maybe I say something that offends, but like, is there a way that we can be in and just like hash it out? And so, yeah, I think that was, I guess I want to end with, this, I guess you ended, Daniel, with this idea of like non-rationality versus rationality, and how do we find like this middle, like what is this like, how can we hold both of them and see the limits of both? And yeah, it does feel to me like the um the political conversation, or maybe not political, but there seems to be, in the circles that I was spending time with, there's this kind of like non-rationality is seen as better than rationality or something. It's seen as higher, and it seems like it's rejecting this maybe historical thing of rationality being higher, but then it creates like an equally as bad problem when you put non-rationality on the pedestal. Either emotionality gets, or the pluralism thing is just like everyone's truth is equally as true, and like that creates a lot of chaos. Holy crap. That creates a lot of internal anguish too, to be in circles where that is kind of like the shared assumption. And it's really difficult to be in a circle where everyone takes their emotions or their subjective experience as the truth. And so I guess what I'm trying to figure out is, Michael, yeah, I appreciate that. I don't know, just like, so I want to add an idea in here to end it off, and I can't really figure out how it relates, but I have a sense that it does. Um, like the political stuff feels very central to all this. Like this political tension that we all face is very like, it plays out in these interactions that we have. Um, and I've been reading this book by Thomas Sowell called Conflicts of Vision, where he talks about like there's, the constrained vision of, humans are constrained, and there's like very much Hayek, like just whatever the institutions are, they help coordinate. No one person can know everything, versus the unconstrained, one person top down controls the systems and creates a good future. And somehow it seems to me that there's kind of a, maybe the rationality, non-rationality fits into that somehow, where if you think the rationality can objectively figure out what is good, that's something that people push off from, but then it creates this other evil on the other side. Um, and so that's kind of my rant. And yeah, I'll stop there. Thank you
No,
for
that's all
listening.
fantastic.
Thank you for
No,
listening.
and that, in my opinion, is Soul's best book on the conflicts of mind, because on that sort of, because what you're seeing right there is basically there is a paradigm or a vision, as he calls it, of which structures what is logical, what is rational, what is possible, right? But the issue is that vision itself cannot be reached by a rational calculus. Like, how do you, so the way we, the thing we always talk about, if truth organizes rationality, what you believe is true determines which is non-rational, determines what is rational, then by what process do you arrive at your truth of which structures your rationality? Because you need to have a notion of a truth in order to have a rationality, right? So that is the space of everything. That is the space of our moment. Like, that is the space. That's what I'll call the Gödel point, Kurt Gödel, the point of incompleteness. Like, there is a space in which you apprehend more than calculate, where you apprehend what is true, and based on that vision, to use Soul's language, you determine what you ought to do. which then retrospectively makes it seem like all you did was use rationality, because then it seems like a rational conclusion, and you forget that initial apprehension, that initial vision, of which structured everything that followed. So it's kind of a vanishing meteor almost in that sense. So it goes away. We have not taken seriously that quick step as much as we should in order to properly structure thought, society, etc., so forth. So this has been very dire. There's a few things I'll say because the alienation at home thing. Oh, that's so important. Also, too, on this tension between the rational and the non, I'll say very quickly. For me, this gets at Mr. Luber and I have spoken about this. And we've spoken about it. We've all spoken about it. To me, on this question of what does it look like to properly thread the non-rational and the rational into, dare I say, the non-rational with the non in parentheses. So it's kind of both. This is where, for me, the phenomenology of the artist is such a big deal, which is not the act of reading a novel, but writing a novel. Because when you write a novel, or you do art, or you create something, you get this weird balance between it being logic, writing the story, but also vision, and then inspiration, and then emotion. The phenomenology of the artist, like taking seriously the raw experience of the creative act itself, I think is the key case study to understanding how rationality and non-rationality properly relate together. And that phenomenology has been completely overlooked because we've mostly used phenomenology in service of a rational agent or a neutered subjectivity. We have not used it in service of a particular kind of activity, which I would put as the phenomenology of the artist. And I'm not saying every phenomenologist made this mistake or anything like that. I'm just saying that if you really pay attention to your experience creating something, like really pay attention to what it is like to make something, that will begin to unveil the proper relation of rationality and non-rationality. And then you use that as a model and think through economics with that, politics with that, logic with that. You use that phenomenology and actually say, actually, wait a minute, if rationality and non-rationality are always relating, even when we don't think it is, then we actually need to rethink economic theory in light of this. We need to rethink politics in light of this. We need to rethink sociology in light of this, right? So in the same way that someone like a von Mises or et cetera, so forth, is trying to argue for a rational basis of the market from the experience of the thinking agent, like a kind of phenomenology, and building up to an argument that the market is rational, I would argue what you want to do is actually put on the basis of this the phenomenology of the creative act. And then we begin to see how economic theory, which I think has overlooked things like the solo residual, the problem of creating demand versus stimulating demand, all this has to be brought up, so forgive me for rushing over it. There are mysteries in economics that in my opinion, have been basically kind of assumed over. Like the quick one to put it is basically economics has always assumed demand. Marx does it, everyone does it, which is the idea that people just want things. They just do. They just want things. Okay, well, from that, you create a model of supply and demand, right? And you're good to go. And a whole lot of the time, that model will be wrong, but useful. In fact, basically every thought is incomplete. There's no such thing as a perfect thought, but that doesn't really matter because all models are wrong, but some are useful, right? And wrong, I think a better word is incomplete. Like, I actually sometimes think the categories of true or false are not as useful as overfitting or underfitting, right? That's usually what we're actually doing. When we make a mistake, we tend to take a true notion and overfit it or underfit it. Like, we're very rarely are we entirely wrong. We tend to misorder, misapply, misunderstand, et cetera, so forth. Now, that doesn't mean it's all relative. That means there's a really important skill of judgment and discernment that is part of truth. But that's hard and personal, and we rather outsource it to the machine. Well, that's when we're trying to escape our humanity with machines as opposed to using machines to extend our humanity, which I think is always the great temptation that Ivan Illich would encourage us not to give into. So the phenomenology of the artist is actually a very big deal here, and I think it can be used to rethink many fields. Now, the massive topic of alienation at home and ostracization, which is an insanely important topic, I will speak to after I throw it to Michael, because this one gets into Hume, this gets into givenness. What I'll say just to start on it, for David Hume, if you don't alienate from your common life, then you get absorbed by it, and you could be taken advantage of. You can get pulled into a kind of mass movement, a mob, because you're just thinking like everyone around you. You also could be taken advantage of you by, say, your religious tradition, because you're not able to think and be critical of it. You're not going to stop that manipulation. So it's actually, alienation is necessary for self-defense and necessary for freedom and to open new horizons of possibility. But it ironically feels like you're losing possibility and that you're losing things because there's a certain alienation that occurs. What David Hume wants to describe is the return to common life. You have to leave common life and return to a common life. And so you have to return home through alienation. And the test of philosophy is on the other side of alienation. And that's where it's going to bring out the distinction between bad philosophy and good philosophy. I'll say more, but for now I'll throw it to Michael. Michael, thank you for coming, sir.
Always a pleasure. Yeah, this makes me think of the line in the Bible where Jesus is like, a prophet isn't without honor, and like unless he's back in his own home, right, with his relatives in his own house. Like Jesus said that, of all people, and yeah, it's something that I think there's this tendency for the people that have known us the longest to default in their mind to kind of like the most I guess like primitive or like base like levels of ourselves, like when we like when we return home. Like I think many people find that when they go home for the holidays, and like they there's this like certain like projection or like imposition of like a certain characterological whatever, and it's like it's hard to be confronted with that, because it feels like you can't like fully imbibe you're becoming like the person that you're trying to be. You're like it feels like you're always kind of like dropped back into that space. And I think that points to a lot of things. I think that points to like kind of the existential anxieties of families in like maybe Aspasia will be familiar with like the psychosynthesis language of like survival unifying centers, which are like these centers that environments create basically to to survive and kind of to inoculate themselves from like the kind of deep wound or like the deep trauma. A lot of people resort to kind of like predictable patterns to try and create a sense, like a pseudo sense of comfort and structure, to insulate themselves from kind of like the terror of like the kind of chaos at home, right? And so like families, I think particularly, are evolution and change are quite threatening to that, right? Like even if it's a structure that kind of everyone intuitively knows is toxic or problematic, it's like what could this family look like on the other side of a difficult conversation between maybe the family is like all left leaning, and then Ethan comes home and he has like new ideas, and it's like, oh, it like could threaten the equilibrium of that. And it's like, in some sense, it's like from kind of like an unprocessed trauma perspective, it's like more threatening to have that structure like rupture potentially than to keep a constricted structure in place. And I think everything that Aspasia and Daniel and me, to a certain extent, like people have talked about with like the toleration of anxiety, like really learning how to like sit with the kind of the difference, like the deep difference, not just like kind of surface level identity difference, but like deep like philosophical difference, and hold that and like still be able to see the spirit of like I'm not like I may be critiquing or challenging something that someone says, but it's not from a standpoint of disagreement. It's from a standpoint of hopefully deeper understanding. And I think that's, Daniel, what you were saying with like the isolation is actually necessary for greater communion, because if you're, in like, I think like I found philosophy first through the East, like through Buddhism, through, the kind of the non-dual kind of perspective on suffering. And that was like very attractive to me at a certain time in my life. And it's not that I like there's still so much wisdom in there, but I think I've realized as I've gotten older, like love is not possible without duality. Because if there isn't a subject, if there isn't an I and a thou, then there's nothing to love, And so there has to be difference for love. Like difference is a necessary precondition for love. And that's ironic and terrifying, because that is also what makes the possibility of the destruction of love like there as well. And so, that's why to love is like the most courageous thing, because you're risking like ultimate self-annihilation at the same time. The other thing that I wanted to talk about was what Andrew was talking about with like AI and, like basically, kind of the argument of like nothing, or if I'm understanding it correctly, like basically nothing someone does with AI really matters, because it's not, it's not like instantiated in the real world. It's not like something, if someone creates an AI caricature of you, like doesn't really matter, because it's not actually you. I was just reflecting on how I think people have been making that argument before AI. And I think it's actually like a huge problem. And so I thought of the example of comedy, where, there's like kind of a movement towards canceling comedians for saying certain jokes, right? And that being emblematic of certain worldviews that are problematic, and people don't want that endorsed. And then like, what is the comedian's response usually to that? Oh, it's just a joke. It's not actually what I believe. It's just a joke. It's harmless. It doesn't really matter. Um, it's not like I'm actually going out and endorsing this, authoritarian regime, or donating to this campaign or whatever. It's just comedy. And people do that like all over the place, where they, whether that's actually true, or whether that's kind of like just a defensive remark, to kind of like, let themselves off the hook. Um, I think we have like a huge problem with um discerning like what is actually consequential, when it comes to speech, um and what is merely kind of play, whether that's like frivolous play, or I think even when you get into like kind of the more like deep serious play, people will talk about like Rebecca. um I think it seems like there's this like in um I don't know, personal evolution, to be able to get to the point where you can hold ideas loosely, and kind of also paradoxically be able to like hold them more deeply. Like there's this training of this capacity to realize that life is a game. So like kind of I can like adopt a certain worldview, put that hat on, and actually be able to sit in it. Um, because in some sense, I'm able to hold my personal identity loosely. I might actually like vehemently disagree with that, thing, but I can like adopt it, and, realize I'm in that arena. Like say I don't know, I've just been watching a lot of this like one stand-up comedian who does a lot of crowd work, and he will like, hit on guys' wives and girlfriends. And like you can tell the people that realize it's just all fun and games, and he doesn't actually mean what he's saying, and the people that are like really offended and upset, you know? And I think people have this like modal confusion of like the arena that they're in, right? Because some arenas are meant for play and that kind of stuff. And also the wisdom to tell, like, if you're at a comedy show and someone is actually being a dick, like, and like it's actually hurtful, and like, you know, you actually need to like stand up for yourself, as opposed to when you can tell like maybe someone's kind of pushing the edge, but like deep down, you know, they realize it's a game, and like, you know, they're they're a genuine person or whatever. Yeah. And I mean, I think therapy is also another arena as well. Like, and I think that's a really important thing, you know, like, I mean, there's uh I can't remember the name of the style of therapy, but like there's a style of therapy where you basically like, you know, you're basically role playing as, you know, a certain family member, and you're, you know, you're pretending to be your dad, and you know, you pretend to say what your dad would say to you, and then you know, you get to respond in a new way. You get to basically like do like inventio of like a new, you know, persona. Empty chair, exactly. Yeah. I mean, I've infamously, I guess, talked to myself in the shower since I was like 5, and like my parents will just hear, and I would like pretend like there would actually be another person. It's not like I was talking to myself. Like I'd be like, "Hey, guy, like, how was your day at school or whatever?" Um, but yeah. Anyways, I'm rambling now. I'll pass it back. Those were just some thoughts, but I think it's yeah. I think we really need to learn the kind of sense of life being a game, and that not importantly not leading to kind of it just all being meaningless, and like, because that can lead very easily to nihilism. But like the life is a, I don't know, life is a game, and we all have important roles to play in it. You know, we all have like, I think, divinely given roles to play in that. But yeah, pass it back.
I mean, if you're not talking to an invisible person, you're doing the whole talking to yourself thing wrong. So I really appreciate your commitment. It's really fantastic. You said a lot there that's really important. I'll throw it to Aspasia here. So first off, yeah, that tension. How do you, in a sense, treat worldviews or views like a game without making it nihilism or relativism? I think this is what Mr. Luber is getting at with theme. Like, you treat things like a story, and yet there is something that is, dare I say, absolute and necessary within those stories, right? Because if you don't do that, you get into trouble. And Daniel, thank you for coming, sir. It's always a pleasure. Because also too, so it should also be noted, the problem is always autonomous anything. Autonomous rationality, autonomous non-rationality, autonomous emotion, autonomous thought. So the issue is there's no such thing as anything that is innately bad, going to Augustine. It's when it's not in a relation with other variables to make it fuller and more complex. So if you get rationality at the expense of emotion, it becomes algebraic, linear, flattening, totalitarian. If you get religion without philosophy, then it becomes flat, totalitarian, and it becomes flat. Autonomous equals flattening and totalitarian, because it becomes total. And bad philosophy for David Hume, like, the trick for thinking is to never become totalizing. Like, Hume is trying to avoid totalizing emotion, totalizing thought, totalizing anything, because once it does that, it becomes tyrannical, right? But then but here's the problem. Every time you go into a domain to train it, quote unquote, let's say you go to train philosophy, then it becomes very easy to lose the habit to connect with your body or your emotions, right? Well, then as you go to connect with your body and your emotions, it becomes very easy to lose the habit of engaging in logical rationality, right? Because everything we do trains us. This is why memory is huge. There is always this need to remember, to keep sight of, to not lose track of, like going into the Minotaur lab with a golden thread, Plato memory, because we are always being habituated into a kind of amnesia of that of which we had before, that if we forget what we are learning now, will become autonomous and therefore incomplete in that autonomy. But there is also a temptation to make it autonomous, because if it is relating, it is therefore complex and more difficult to understand. And the brain hates not understanding. It finds pleasure in understanding. The brain wants to flatten reality. It naturally wants to, because it gives you a sense of understanding. It gives you a grasp of the whole. So that's also one of the reasons why, if you introduce complexity to a family, everything Anxiety can be tied to that feeling of opening up, therefore not understanding, therefore you lose the pleasure of understanding, and that creates anxiety. Anxiety is a result of a certain loss of a mental pleasure that is found in the equilibrium. But if you don't lose it, as David Hume points out, if you never give up that, and C.S. Peirce is the same, if you never give up that equilibrium and fixedness, then you run the risk of being flattened, linear, manipulated, part of a totalitarian movement, all of these different things. So you need, and also smothering your emotional life and mental development. So that all becomes a very big problem. I have many more things to say. I think the phenomenology of the artist is also, I think, a
You
very
lost your
good.
picture.
Yep.
There you
Oh,
are.
I froze. Oh man, nice freeze. Ah. Oh, is that the screenshot? Oh, I froze again. Man, the garage does this sometimes. Oh, now. What if I do the Pam's Labyrinth thing? You know the Pam's Labyrinth. I'm gonna cover my hands. You know, if I do this, yes, there I go. Remember, have anyone seen? You can probably hear me. I really hope you can hear me. Has anyone?
I think it's Ethan. Oh, there you are.
Hi, everyone. I'm so sorry. I don't. Asper, I'll throw it to you. I was just going to say the phenomenology of the artist gives you that experience of believing in something that you also hold as not true, and yet it's not relativism. Like in the phenomenology of the artist, you start seeing this art form of this ability to occupy creations, and yet a good artist knows the things they're creating are not merely fiction. They have some sort of participation in reality. They have some sort of participation in what is actual, right? And so there's something in that phenomenology that holds a great truth. But I will throw it to Aspasia. Aspasia, I'm sorry that I froze. It's great to see you. I hope you're well.
Lovely to see you too. I am well. I was positing that perhaps you hadn't frozen. This was just a ploy to create like a generated group anxiety.
Oh, yeah, that would have been fantastic performance art. Oh, I wish I was that witty.
Always experiential.
That would have been brilliant. Oh, my goodness.
I initially put up my hand, it was really to speak to the points that I've been making in the chat, where I just want to, again, as I often do, draw out some of the importance of what we mean when we talk about experiencing emotions, because I think that gets jumped over very quickly. And that really what we're talking about is there is this desperate need, I think, for most people, for society at large, to learn what it means to deepen and intensify the experience of an emotion. And the experience of an emotion happens in our body. It's absolutely nothing to do with outward action. I think we are desperate. We desperately need to learn ways to increase our capacity to do that, to sit with and feel more intensely, actually, which is counterintuitive to what a lot of people think they need to be doing. They think, I feel too much. I have a problem. My emotions are too intense. And they're usually relating that to the fact that they are acting impulsively, if we call it that, or acting out, or letting emotions lead their actions before they bring online more critical thinking. These sorts of things, but that's all to do with action, right? So already there is a failure there of being able to tolerate and hold the intensity of the bodily experience, because that is what an emotion is. It's a bodily, well, that's how I look at it. It's a bodily experience. There is a huge chunk of people out there that don't even have a bodily experience at all. It is really all coming from up here, and it's almost an intellectual sense of pressure that they must act quickly as well. So the need to deepen and intensify emotional experiencing in the body in order to be able to reclaim, I guess, if we go, it links to the memory piece in that for a lot of us, we have learnt very early on in life that we can't do that, we shouldn't do that, it's dangerous to do that. And so we construct all these other systems that keep us away from ever going near that level of intense feeling in our body. And that includes anxiety. So anxiety is a signal that comes online to let us know that we are starting to feel too deeply or too intensely a particular emotion in a particular type of relationship. The anxiety floods our system to let us know to get out of that, because it's trying to get us out of deepening the feeling any further, because that might tell us something that we're not supposed to know because we could never do anything about, which we learn when we're young and we could actually do something about now, but we never get to consciously understand that now as an adult, because this anxiety thing floods us and we get out of the situation. So what So what's important about learning as adults, how to be with our emotions in our body for longer without needing to do anything at all, without acting out. We need to do that because this is what is going to give us trust in that type of experience. And what I mean by that is it allows us to trust the role of emotion. We don't trust emotion, a lot of us. We think that it is something that is going to overtake us and cause us to do all sorts of impulsive, self-destructive things because of this failure. So it's not easy to do because you have to push through all these different levels of anxiety that have been built up. But it's not just anxiety. There's a whole lot of defensive stuff that we learn that is relational in nature, can be dissociative, can be a lot of these cognitive errors we make, these ways, we use thinking heuristics incorrectly and all this stuff. So it is a hard process. And I know that I come at it from obviously a therapy perspective, which is just, it's different to the real world. But when we go back to something like family relationships, it's really tricky because I don't know that it's even, if we go back into our family and we start to speak differently and we want to deepen our connection with someone in our family, and so we are trying to share something of an emotionally deeper kind or a more honest variant. I don't know that it's necessarily just the loss of pleasure. It's that for the other person, this is probably pulling on a thread that starts to activate feelings that they have learned are taboo in my relationships. As an example, rage or whatever it is. I don't like that you are pointing out something that I do that deep down I might know actually isn't as well-intentioned as I think, or isn't all I can do. I actually do have deeper capacity, but I tell myself the story that this is all I can give, this is all I can do. And you are pointing that out to me, and that's generating anger inside me towards you, that you are, sort of holding this mirror up to me or forcing me to look at something that I don't like looking at, hasn't gone well for me to look at in the past. But oftentimes we don't even experience that as anger. We just experience that as, I feel so anxious. I don't like this conversation. This person's being mean to me. I want to get out. And that is, again, because we haven't learned how to push through that anxiety to see that underneath that there's probably a different feeling. I wonder what that is. I wonder why I'm having that feeling here with this person when they're doing this. What might that say about me and how I show up in relationships, as opposed to what it says about what this person's doing to me and what that must mean about them. It's very, very hard. It's very, very hard in families. Yeah, and without delving into that in too much depth. And I do want to talk a little bit just briefly too about yes, this idea that when we are trying to talk in a relationship, when we are trying to talk about these difficult things and we are trying to address something that's been going on in a relationship that hasn't been working for us, the idea is that we are, as Michael was saying, like we're doing that because we're trying to deepen connection. It's not an aggressive act. It's not us trying to push the person further away or to dominate. It would be an attempt to connect if we're trying to deepen the connection, right? But the problem is that we aren't well equipped to have those sorts of conversations. And obviously, Daniel, you and Michelle talk about this all the time. We're not well equipped as a society to have those sorts of conversations. Conversations are more like someone wins and someone loses. And if someone's pointing something out to me, that's because I need to, either accept what they're saying about me, or I need to present the evidence that they're wrong. And so it is just a different kind of conversation, and it requires a much slower pace for that reason. And I think to try and set that up from the start as much as you can is really important, to even just signal at the start that I want to talk to you about something, but this is the reason why. Like it's in an attempt to actually connect, like to try and set as much of that groundwork as you can, which still, 90% of the time will probably be meaningless the second that you activate a feeling in them that they're not used to having, and, you know, all that stuff comes online, but at least there's an attempt there. And I think that's really important. And there is a role, something else that we were talking about here just before you froze, Daniel. There is a role here for what's to do with playfulness. There's a role here for trying to loosen someone up. I think it's important that we can have spontaneity, obviously, in relationships and meaningful relationships. We need to have spontaneity of, I want to talk to you about something, and not feeling like we have to be so careful with our words. And but there's a difference between spontaneity and just sort of like a carelessness, that comes more from a superficial place, I think. So spontaneity, but spontaneity that's somehow linked to deepest emotion. It's difficult to find the language to talk about it as it emerges, and that is where the spontaneity matters. But I think that gets confused with this idea of like just carelessness. Like that licenses me somehow to just be able to just talk like frivolously, without actually connecting into the deep emotion. I'm just going to kind of like sort of superficially touch the top of it, and then I'm going to tell you all about how that links to all the ways that you've pissed me off in the past. And, you know, when you do that, like, you remember that time 3 Christmases ago, and like just sort of go on this, that's no longer tethered, like that's not spontaneous like speech of the kind that I'm suggesting is healthy and necessary in these conversations. That is just sort of careless, frivolous speech. Which is likely to do more harm than good, and also not actually likely to help you to really get to the root of what you're feeling about it, nor then will the other person be able to meet you there and figure out what's happening for them, and you're not going to be able to do something meaningful about it. So all of that is important. Forgive me, I've just written down quick notes, and so it's all a little bit jumbled. Yeah, I think I've said all that. Yeah, but this idea of helping an adult to learn to feel intensely in their body and to just sit with it. I mean, that is essentially like in the therapy room. You know, that is also why things like, you don't just go over and, you know, hug your client while they're having a really intense feeling. It's hard sometimes to just let them sit there, but like, you are trying to help an adult see that they are capable of having this whole thing happen in their body. Another person can sit with them and have presence and be connected in that way. But nothing else needs to happen. They don't need to do anything. No one needs to do anything to them. It's because there's a process to it, and it's trying to allow a person to have enough experiences as an adult of that rise and fall of that, and what is revealed on the other side of it, and the dropping away of all that anxiety that comes on the other side of it. Like, it's an incredible thing. And it's very counterintuitive to just feel the relaxation in the body, to feel the clarity of thinking and presence after that feeling has passed. And it can be very quick, like that could be, you know, just 30 seconds, or that could be like a passing of an emotion over like, you know, half an hour. It's generally not that long. But it's, once you have enough of that, then your body, this is the memory piece, you start to trust that that's what can happen, that that's what will happen, that it's not necessary to make these other quick movements outwardly. Yeah, I just wanted to throw that piece in there. Several pieces.
Absolutely magnificent. Absolutely magnificent. One of the things, like what you were just, so a few things, and then I'll throw it to Mr. Jockin and Ethan here. It is always remarkable to me how simply stating, and you pointed this out many times, Aspasia, if I can just say, I felt anger when you said that, not as a judgment, just a statement of fact, how just the ability to articulate the reality, that itself changes things. You don't, more than like to accurately describe, itself brings about solution versus idea of the solution. Like Michelle and I talk about that all the time. Like when you say, when all you do is talk about how you interpreted the situation, almost like by magic, that itself solves the situation without having an effort of a solution. Like there, and I think that's tied to this philosophical mystery of realization, opening things up more than thinking up a good idea. And also it shows that merely the ability to put everything on the table so that you apprehend is a very important mental faculty versus just calculation. You know, the way I've spoken to it with the, you know, Sam Green, who wrote The Mermaid, is there's the calculation 1 + 1 + 1 = 3. And we're trying to figure out how to solve our problem. And then, as I think some people are doing with verbal processing, for example, and we've made this example before, you know those pictures where I get a bunch of small pictures on a wall and I step back and I walk around and then I see the big picture, like those optical illusions? That is often actually when you are just describing accuracy and putting small pictures, then you apprehend something that you could have never calculated to. And many people in their relationships, in my opinion, are trying to solve problems by a means of calculation that must be done by apprehension. But you can only put the little pictures on the wall if people are able to say, this is what I felt, and do nothing, and it not cause anything. Just put it out, and then you add this, you add this, you add this, you add this, and then bam. But you're only going to do that if you can handle the emotions in your body that arise as you're saying these things. Because as you say, when you said that made me upset, you're probably scared. You're probably nervous. Your body is going crazy because you just want to repress it. So in order to put the thing out there, you have to be able to actually handle what is going through your body, right? And I mean, love, I think, is a big one because, like, love is the space where this is, love is present to the degree that I think you can basically make possible these horizons and do this kind of work of apprehension. And I think also that, like, I guess also too, as you were speaking, so this power of apprehending, well, this also gets to why the skills, you know, we talk about creative writing all the time, like the skills of description, the ability to articulate seem to mysteriously be tied to the ability to think. And you would say, why? You know, why does speaking and thinking go together? Because it really, if speaking is just signifiers, what does it matter? Because speaking and describing well determines the things on the table that make possible an apprehension of a whole, like the connections, right? And if you're limited in your speech, you're limited into the little small pictures you can put on the wall to apprehend a whole. You're limited in what you could describe to see something you can't calculate to. So the ability to speak well allows you to apprehend things that otherwise you would have never calculated to. And I would argue that history is actually that very process. Like history, like the movement of history is putting little pictures on the wall, similar to the speech act, that then you arrive at a certain point where you can apprehend something that was always latent, but you needed all the experiences of history to see, such as you needed the experiences of utility and efficiency and pragmatism, as we were talking about with Luber, to get to the place where you could apprehend the truth that was latent, which is we want the fullness of time. We don't want to waste time. We want to be efficient. Not for utility, but for the fullness of life, actually. But you had to put all the little experiences. History had to do the process of putting all the little histories out, having all the little experiences so that you could apprehend this whole. And the claim here is that basically verbal processing is in a sense isomorphic and fractal of what history is doing on the larger scale. So to the degree that we are actually able to carry out the speech act properly is to the degree that we are aligned with history's unfolding, and in so doing, I think, have the kind of subjectivity that makes possible the new address. I will also comment, because I have too many notes, is that notion, like that idea of, I think when people are like, I'm just expressing myself, right? I'm just telling you what I feel. That also, to me, is tied to the loss. We don't have the phenomenology of the artist because people think art is just expression. You're just saying everything. No. As Mr. Luber will tell us, and is correct, is art is very structured. It is very difficult. It is not just it is expression, but it's not merely expression, right? But since we have the wrong metaphor of what art is, I think we bring that into our lives and therefore say, I need to be free like the artist to express myself. But that's not what artists do. Artists are in this structure, creativity balance that is going together. So I think having the wrong metaphor to understand what expressing ourselves is, which I think is perhaps carried over from a misunderstanding of the creative act, has hurt our understanding of what we need to do when we are speaking. Because I think speaking is a creative and artistic act. I think therapy is. But if we don't know what art is, then to say that speaking is a creative act or therapy is a creative act will not help the situation. In fact, it could metaphorically lead us in the wrong direction. I think it's a major problem. I think it contributes to the sort of things that Mr. Nelson was describing. The last thing I'll say just very, very quickly is also that I think just as a quick note, basically on this question of the right kind of philosophy, that's if your philosophy does not make space for therapy, if your philosophy does not make space for going home and having people that don't like philosophy and actually your ability to be with them is part of your philosophy, if your philosophy does not have something that is able to allow people not liking philosophy and that's actually good for you, then actually it's the wrong philosophy. And that's kind of, I think, starting to get at what Mr. Nelson was saying earlier. Like if you have a philosophy that makes you better than people that don't do philosophy, it's the wrong philosophy because you can't return in that. Right? And if your philosophy does not have a philosophy of how the anxiety of dealing with the other is good for you, that's a problem. I think also, I just want to say quick, like that idea of the emotion in people and that's what they're reacting to. I think very often what makes people get upset is the feeling of this person is making me surprise myself by myself. Like I'm feeling an emotion that I didn't know I could feel. They're saying new ideas and now I am surprised by myself and I don't like that. I don't like to be a surprise to myself because and that's tied to the unwillingness to go into your body and emotions, right? And that's also why we talk all the time about preparation for surprise, the ability to handle surprise and counterology, because if you're not able to handle that, one day someone's going to say something that's going to make you feel or think something that surprises you that you feel or think that thing. And if you're not ready for that, you may blow up on that person. You're not able to handle it. You're going to become judgmental and you're going to not rise to the occasion of that moment. So it is very, very important to be able to handle that. But I will stop and throw it to Mr. Jockin, then Mr. Nelson, and if anyone else has anything to say. Mr. Jockin, thank you for coming.
It's good to see everybody. Ethan, it's my first time seeing you on the net, so welcome. It's good to see a new person on the net. So actually, I want to kind of connect what Aspasea said and what Ethan brought up initially, because I know with like Luber and Javier and other people in this kind of the net circle, we refer to the non-net people in our everyday life as normies. We use that kind of internet talk. So I'm sympathetic to this point because there is very much like, I got news, guys, we're a little cult. You guys know that, right? Like you try to speak girdle, like there's a whole vocabulary of initiation that we have intelligibility what it means and has net relationships to, if only in a vibe sense, that if we try to do this with our parents, or coworkers or other individuals in an explicit way, they will be actually confused what's going on. So here's the point. Why are we not a cult? Even though I'm joking around about it, because we're not asking some demand of initiation of a complete authorization of the other relationships. Because what Daniel just said, right? If this whole project of philosophy's project was to isolate us from all other relationships, it would be a cult because it would say, no, we have the truth. All those people don't have the truth. They either have to convert to our religion or cult or remove, exit. But we're not doing that. My point, but the very fact, though, at least I know that, again, Lois Luber was on the call to verify this, my point. But I know privately with Luber and Javier, we do use the language of normie versus us, like this little net group, basically, or other people on these projects of thought. Because we know there's a language discourse we're doing, a project of doing investigation inquiry that we can't connect with other people about. And some of the people that we care very much deeply about in our lives, our parents, spouses, things like that. It doesn't invalidate it. It just simply points out, like, I think it's an issue of pointing out that you have to see, like you said, Daniel, the harmony of this, the cultivation of philosophy in this group is not necessarily just for the sake of the truth and having the truth by itself, but cultivating a subjectivity of a kind of person. And by the way, unrelated to that, it's actually why Daniel, and the phenomenology of the artist is so important, because one of the most shout outs to Daniel's course coming up, creative writing. Everyone should take that course, because actually I think what's actually related to not only people having emotions and then exploding on it, they don't have fitting articulation. And that's what the creative arts give you, an ability to articulate. This is also why I'm very sympathetic to art therapy or other things that allow the disclosure of the self in the artistic medium or different modes of discourse. I even think what was brought up before about hypothetical positionality, that's role playing. acting. Actually, I've done therapy treatments in the same manner. It's actually incredibly therapeutic to kind of work with thought and kind of put yourself in multiple positions and operate and thinking through it. So, but these are all kind of modes of discourse, of disclosure that allows a deeper understanding. Because I think the biggest point about trauma is you don't remember. You don't remember the trauma. And you want to run away from the trauma. So this is actually why Daniel note to me, or actually in the note on the net, better said it 2 weeks ago, the reward of virtue is memory. Because it's only in virtue and the cultivation of a relationship of love that you actually have access to memory. Because you want to forget otherwise. Why remember painful things, especially when you can't bear it. And it actually requires, I think actually the big issue is that a lot of times we get caught up in the symbolic relationships over meaning games of maps. They kind of quote Daniel a little bit on this one. Meaning, like, if you're not part of this map, I can't relate to you. But I find that interesting because in relationships, especially I can speak for myself because of my family relationships, I can't have the net conversations with them. You know what I can do? I can, when I visit them, give them a little kiss on the forehead. That does a lot more to saying I love you to someone. Can express what I want to say to them than any words I can say. This is an example that language, while it has lots of power, I think creative writing is really important to allow us a deeper penetration of reality with our use of language. And Daniel talked before about this. Literature and other modes of discourse basically reveal more reality because it allows us to reflect and back on it. But even just the activities of the body working in relationship with others, I think it's still a very powerful way we can relate to each other. And I think I saw in the chat, I mean, I'm of the conclusion too, love is really the only answer. If you're in these spaces where there are this breaks between the intellective spaces like this, like the net, and the more, I mean, even made the comment of like the survivalship friendships, I would just say the everyday. Because that's how relationships were generally based on, necessity. Either necessity or contingent requirement of response. But nevertheless, you still can have a relationship of love with that, meaning showing care. And I think actually memory. I think actually memory is a very important aspect of that. Simple acts of remembering what they like to eat, what's a big event happening in their lives. It actually does a lot more to build a relationship and communing with them than any discourse speech could, in my opinion. Obviously, you can do that too and have a better and deeper relationship. I'm just simply speaking on kind of what can we do in the kind of not have this schism. I question the point of this whole project or discussion is not to run away into the intellectual cult of the net and just kind of isolate from all the world, but they go back to kind of do a platonic discussion from the allegory of the cave. They go out and then come back in, not from the sake of just stamping on the truth to everybody else, but in relationship to the other. That's the only answer I can think of myself. That's all for me.
No, that's 100% correct. So there's a few things. So it's very interesting how it would seem as if every culture could potentially be a cult. And the question is, what's the difference between cult and culture? It seems to have something to do with openness, the ability to integrate otherness, and yet maintain a membrane. Because there's always a problem of when you bring in otherness, you lose your differentiation, it becomes chaos, right? So a culture is able to be open to otherness and difference at a rate and in a way that does not dissolve it or its social intelligibility or destroy its meaning and belonging. Because that's like the $1 million problem with belonging is that people feel belonging because they feel a certain degree of this is special. You could say special. This is unique. This is not like other things, right? But to the degree it is unique, then to the degree it is difficult to be intelligible to people outside of it. And also the other poses a threat to it because the more you bring in otherness, it may have to lower its standards or try to keep its standards up by adding a new complexity to it. But then everyone in it can feel burdened by the need to add that complexity and otherness. So they have to be prepared by this. And so there's always the temptation to close, to turn a culture into a cult or to shut the border, right? Now, if you have entirely open borders, though, you get your own chaos, right? So what does it look like to have borders that are nevertheless more membranic, people can enter, that maintain a certain level of assimilation while not forcing people to assimilate in a certain way? How in the world do you do that? How do you make people who are different in their difference assimilate without losing their difference? Isn't that freaking impossible? Well, that's part of what the challenge is. And so there's a few things. Also to the skill, like this is where we talk about the meta language skill, right? Because as you create a discourse, it becomes more unintelligible to people to understand who are not in the discourse, unless they are the kind of person who can enter into a space, not understand everything being said, and not judge it though as wrong. That's a major skill. Like the ability to enter and hear things you don't understand and not assume it's their problem versus mine. Because most of the time when you read a book you don't understand, the temptation is to say it's a bad book. Well, maybe you need to up the ante, right? Well, that's what you need, right? But the point is that there's something about discourses through time, and the same goes with individuals, that singularize. They become more singular, meaning that to get it, you have to be in it, right? As you increase singularization, so it becomes more difficult to maintain social intelligibility to people who are outside that discourse or singularity. Oh, and by the way, if you don't singularize, you're more likely to be manipulated. The dictator's more likely to capture you. You're going to be part of the banality of evil. So if you don't develop, oh, and also the nature of ideas, if you really, really think about them, naturally leads you to discourse that is complicated and difficult. Not because you say, I want it to be difficult, not because I want it to be a discourse that you only get if you're part of it, but because the nature of actually things is that of which when you really, really look at them, you find out that actually there is a latent complexity that comes with things. And also you find out that the dictionaries didn't give us all the words we needed to understand phenomenon. We find out that the society's been using the word freedom to mean too many things at the same time, and we're confused. So we find out we have to differentiate freedom from, freedom to, freedom in. Not because we said, I just want to be difficult, but because we found out that literally, based on our qualitative experience of the world, not our ideas, our experiences of reality, have unveiled that there are different kinds of freedom, right? And so if I use the word freedom to describe all those things at the same time, it creates trouble. So you create terms and distinctions in order to be real, not difficult. This is very important. Like, why do you come up with a distinction between geopedic and the algebraic? That is so critical. Because you qualitatively experience a difference in how people relate that there is not language for, and without that language, there's trouble, right? Of which then, of course, you have to be in the discourse to get that linguistic difference, of which then to everyone outside of it will seem silly and unnecessary. And yet it wasn't created arbitrarily. It was created from a necessity of experiential difference. And this necessity is actually one that gives us a possibility of belonging and givenness that is not based on a top-down imposition, because it comes from the experience. But this means you have to be really open to experience. But as you do that, you inherently must singularize to only be grasped and really understood by people who have had similar experiences. So how do you relate to the people who have not had those experiences, right? How do you maintain a culture without being a cult? Well, it becomes very, very important to have a certain skillfulness in language, a certain openness to the other, and actually gets us, like everything you're describing, Mr. Jockin, is the Humean problem of how do you return to common life and genuinely value the person who thinks you're crazy, and genuinely value the person who thinks you're wasting your time. Because if you say, I want to do it, no, it doesn't work that way. You can't just say, I want to do it. You have to do it like flipping a switch, like a light bulb. You have to do certain work to be the kind of being that genuinely does it. It's like a certain gym that one has to go to. And I think this gym is tied to encounters of lack and beauty, as we've spoken about many times. I'm actually down to this now. I'm out of notes, so the rest of my notes have to be really small, and I probably won't be able to read them. But I'll stop and throw it to Mr. Nelson and then Mr. DeClerc. And if anyone has anything else to say, please, Mr. Nelson.
I appreciate it. Yeah, fascinating. I'm really enjoying this net. I'm having the thought of like, oh, I should have been doing this more. This is amazing. Glad to have found it in this way, come around to it. Yeah, really fascinating. I really love that last point you actually just made, Daniel, about how you return to common life and like genuinely care about people and manage those differences. I have not figured that out at all. That is tough, and I think I personally tend to bias towards a little bit of self-righteousness or a little bit of doing a bunch of philosophy and finding it hard to come back into common life effectively and with grace, and not making all of my relationships a little bit more clunky and uh, as a result. And yeah, a lot of times it's hard to have very fluid of relationships that and to navigate them when there's all of these crazy thoughts and perspectives that don't make sense in my head. And then how do I show up? I think there was a point that you made, Daniel, about like it's hard to like have confidence in a worldview, and maybe that was Michael as well, of like play and serious play and putting on this worldview, but not like maybe disagreeing with it, but still being able to inhabit it. Um, yeah, I find it really hard to get over the confusion and then to get into this place of like, yeah, I don't, this isn't absolutely true. And yet, how can I just like have conviction? Is it an emotional thing? Is it like I choose to have conviction until I get proven otherwise, and just fear is the thing that gets in the way, and the anxiety. And so that's really interesting. But I wanted to touch on this phenomenology of the artist point, because this is really fascinating to me, and this is something that I've been sitting with lately. Um, because yeah, it's like when I'm in a state of creating, I feel phenomenal, and time feels good, and flow is effortless, and I just feel like good, like life just feels right somehow, and there's like this very visceral experience of like my reality feels somehow, it makes sense, even if it doesn't logically perfectly make sense. It creates that experience. And I was actually reading this book by Ayn Rand about a month ago, The Romantic Manifesto. And she says some really, really fascinating stuff in here. I wanted to actually just pull a couple lines out of here. Um, she says, art is a selective recreation of reality according to an artist's metaphysical value judgments. It's the integrator and concretizer of man's metaphysical abstractions. It's the voice of his sense of life. Um, and that point, and she also makes the claim that um, yeah, art is the concretization of metaphysics. But she makes the point that like, okay, we have these kind of like needs, right? We have like survival needs. I need to get food and shelter and survival. I need to feel a sense of community and relationship and psychological needs. Um, and a lot of times, like with Maslow's hierarchy, it's like self-actualization, or we could like think like art, how I've kind of related to that is at the top. But she makes this point, which is like it's almost like more fundamental than our basic needs. Like it almost like the process of like art, it almost like gives us a reason to live and then take care of our basic needs and our psychological needs. And that's something that makes a lot of sense to me. Like when I'm creating a lot of art, it's a lot easier to do the chores around the house and like, to enjoy relationships and stuff like this. And all these things get a lot easier when that artistic process is fundamental. Um, and yeah, it's like it brings me to the thought of, yeah, how does one make a living in this world without losing that? It's a very, very difficult one to solve. For and it's like, do you make your living as a philosopher? Does that inherently sabotage the effectiveness of the philosophy that you're doing, right? And it's like, do I become an internet philosopher and just make a living by getting a bunch of views, or does that lead to capture of the philosophy that I'm actually doing? And then all of a sudden, the goal of doing philosophy for a living then subverts the effectiveness of actually trying to do that. And or yeah, I think Daniel, you and I have had this conversation before of like sometimes like manual labor can actually give the mind space to think about things, and it might actually like there's a way in which more mundane work might actually allow us to like go do philosophy as we're going about our days. Whereas like in my line of work, being in technology and business and all this stuff, I need to use my mind all the time, and I need to be strategizing, and I need to be doing these things, which kind of makes me have to like delegate philosophical thinking to the outskirts of my day. But maybe that's where art comes in. Maybe like, I don't know, I have this curiosity around, does like art when it creates this experience of flow, it's like it doesn't matter how tired my physical body is, like if that flow state is strong enough, or if the curiosity and the like the art almost is like self-sustaining in a way. So it almost feels like art is the only thing that actually like I will have the energy for after a long day. And so yeah, it's a really interesting question that I'm trying to grapple with, of like, how does one live a philosophical life and also make a living? But uh yeah, I guess what I'll end off with is just kind of like a U-turn, but really going towards one of the last things that was being said about culture. Um yeah, I can't quite figure out how to really go deep into some of these philosophical endeavors and not also kind of like isolate myself, or like it almost feels like the honoring of differences, maybe that's something that comes like after the period of alienation, is maybe what I was hearing earlier. But it almost is like during the period of alienation and what I'm currently experiencing, it feels like really hard to hold that difference effectively. And so that's something that I grapple with. And maybe art's the solution. I don't know, but I'll stop there. Thank you for listening.
Oh, this is grand. All the great stuff. Thank you so much, Ethan. I appreciate it. Grace has a new Hello Kitty outfit, so you might see an appearance. So everything there is really, really important. So there's a few things, and then I'll give it to Michael, and if anyone has anything else to say on this fine evening. Yeah, no, it's very important with Ayn Rand. Like, we see, like, it's very important. Like, the banker and Atlas Shrugged is saying, I love life. Gulch has a lot of friends. It's not this idea that Ayn Rand is getting at some sort of autonomous, like, selfishness at the expense of other people is kind of a straw man. What we see is this kind of idea that there's a certain honoring of the individual that is necessary for friendship, relation. Basically, her big thing is coercion. Like, it's perfectly fine to help other people as long as you're not coerced by the state to do it, right? And so he has this sort of idea that art is supposed to reflect the metaphysic, right? There's a certain vision and a certain metaphysic that's supposed to come out through art, etc., so forth. And to the degree that art basically sees itself as pure expression, and she's very concerned with art separating philosophy and thinking that that's not going to lead in unintentional consequences, because basically she also is suggesting that art is always already metaphysical. There is already some sort of vision, and if you're not careful, that's going to lead to unintentional consequences, right? So I think that's also very important, because she is actually suggesting that there is something about singularization and individuation that is actually necessary for friendship. But the way they deal with the problem of a screwed up world is basically isolationism. And if we're not going to go in the direction of something coldish, I know at the end they go back out, then the question is, can we have a new address that's not a gold, right? Now, of course, maybe not, right? But I think lack and beauty are tied to this. And also to the psychoanalytic is missing from Rand's vision, which I think is also really, really big. Now, of course, that has to be expanded on, but there are many, many straw men against what Atlas Shrugged is about that I think have not helped think the very serious problems that are coming out. And actually, I think the money speech that that is given in the 300s is actually a very important speech, because many people who are anti-money, you think money is the root of all evil, but have you ever asked what is the root of money? Money is but a means of exchange. So he goes into the guns. He's exactly right. Like, if you get rid of guns, you end up in coercion. Oh, you have like a scarf thing now. Nice. So you end up in coercion and different trouble, right? So this is very problematic. But then here's the issue. The critique of Ayn Rand's Atlas Shrugged is, well, there is no such thing as John Galt, though. There are no Galtian people. Everyone is a mixture of Leechers and Galt, and they have Galt potential, but it's behind Leechers that there's no such thing as a John Galt. If there was, then we'd be good to go. But actually, unfortunately, it's more likely that we get Dagny's brother, we get the bad people, right? Now, I'm not so dismal to say that there is no such thing as a John Galt, but I do think it's the case that more often people are Shakespearean characters that are a mixture of different things. But how is it, though, this sort of notion of, I would even say the geopadic that we see that is going through in Rand? How is it that we can actually realize that in a manner that is dealing with this way that we are all mixtures of looters and Gauls? And I would also say this, when we become looters, per se, we don't even realize we're doing it. Like, actually, very often what makes us become quote-unquote looters is precisely processes that we think will make us John Galt, because the nature of reality is ironic. The things that are actually going to lead to our self-realization turn out to just make us another CEO that is in bed with the government that C describes. The problem is we don't know how to be John Galt. We think we do, and that's what leads us to being Dagny's brother. We don't know how to make Galts Galts. We think we do, and that's actually what leads us to creating a Silicon Valley that then, if it is overfitting in different ways, is not able to identify how it's overfitting. And yet, it would seem extremely erroneous to suggest that therefore any vision of a Galt's Galts is wrong. Because once you do that, you end up basically still with the pathologies of the command economy and everything that she's describing. And that's the tension we're in. And we rather not think that tension because it makes everything really difficult. I think also, so there's a few more things. There's a real sense in which you can't have difference without alienation, because alienation breaks you away, right? So if no one ever breaks away, then no one's ever different. So alienation almost becomes a prerequisite for diversity, right? Now, the other thing that could cause diversity is simply geography. Most of history, societies are different because they have different access to water, they have different culture, and terrain creates diversity. And you could say that the diversity that most of the world has had has simply been a reflection of geography. Geography is way more of an impact on societies than people realize usually. It has a really big impact, and you get from that. But assuming we're not talking about the difference that is given by geography, which does tend to be flattened in a global village, as Marshall McLuhan said, where everyone's connected by the digital, like those differences tend to be mediated more and more, although they're still very, very real. The difference that seemingly is needed for the kind of subjectivity that can handle the anxiety of otherness must go through alienation, because that alienation is a breaking away from that of which makes you unable to handle difference so that you can differentiate into the kind of being who can. So alienation is a necessary step. So David Hume described it this way. We all start in a common life, okay? We have a common life, and that's how we organize. And he said, then what can occur? And so he's describing the philosopher's life, okay? So the philosopher begins in a common life, and then they start questioning the common life. Why do we do it this way? Why do we do it that way? And he says, this begins the philosophical ascent. So here's your common life, and you start questioning, you rise above the common life, okay? And it begins the philosophical ascent. Now, here's the problem. The philosophical ascent also tends to breed philosophical melancholia and philosophical resentment, which is that as you pull away, you can no longer relate to anyone, and you become melancholic. And that is, I think, basically the meaning crisis. Absolutely what David Hume is describing is the meaning crisis, because you become melancholic because you can no longer relate. As you become melancholic, the great temptation of the philosopher is in their melancholy to deal with it by becoming resentful and self-important. So as you become melancholic, you can overcome that feeling by pride, by saying, I'm better than those people. Those people don't get it. And you give yourself a meaning and purpose by reforming those people. And so what he sees is philosophy births the tyrant. And actually, you get the tyrannical philosopher king, who is someone that thinks to philosopher has all the great ideas, and they're now going to fix all those common folk, right? And that's bad philosophy. So you have the thoughtlessness of common life, where you don't question anything, okay? And you get the bad philosophy gives you the philosophical tyrant. So you would hear that and say, well, I guess Mr. Hume is anti-philosophy, right? That sounds really, really bad. And he said, yeah, but here's the problem. In the common life, you end up with Hannah Arendt's banality of evil. You don't question anything, and guess what your common life is? Nazism. Your common life is white people are better than black people. Christians are better than other religions. Your common life makes it given that everyone but you is wrong, and it's given that you need to get rid of them, right? So you create violence. The other thing with common life is if you don't question anything and your king tells you to, well, give up your land or to take everything, you have no basis to question or defend yourself, right? Because you don't have thought, you don't have philosophy, right? So you need to develop philosophy. But wait, didn't you say philosophy drags us out of common life into philosophical melancholia and resentment? Yep, you have to go through it. You have to go through the melancholia. You have to go through the alienation. But here's the key. So you go from common life to the quote-unquote ivory tower. You leave common life to the ivory tower. You get a philosophical journey. The key step is to return to common life. You have to go from the ivory tower back to common life. How do you reintegrate, though? How do you reintegrate? You've ascended over it, and yet you nevertheless choose to go back to it. How do you do that, right? If you cannot do this, you cannot have a good philosophy. Now, ways that Hume gets at this is you see your role as the philosopher, and this will allude to Clayton's work, as basically defending the common life. You are using philosophy to keep out anyone that would try to manipulate it, anyone who would bring ideas on why it is wrong, anyone who would bring condemnation, tyrants, dictators, kings. You're using philosophy. Here's the key. David Hume understood philosophy deconstructed. You know how everyone's like the postmodern deconstructs and that's all a problem? He said, no, that's its weapon of self-defense. You can deconstruct anyone that comes in to destroy your common life. Because if they come in with ideas on why you're wrong, you can deconstruct it. Deconstruction was supposed to be used as a weapon of self-defense of a common life. That's what David Hume envisioned. He didn't use the language of deconstruction. That's abso-frickin-lutely what he's talking about. Deconstruction is how you defend your common life. What ended up happening is the weapon of deconstruction was realized later in the 20th century, and it was used, people used it on themselves versus as a posture of defense. They used deconstruction not to create boundaries of sacred spaces, but in order to remove spaces entirely. And so that has led to a problem. And then it gets on to all the Philip Reeve stuff, right? So deconstruction is supposed to be used as self-defense and to maintain a common life. And you're supposed to use philosophy to steward a common life. He's all about this. He's all about the agricultural language. Philosophy is you're defending in order to steward. You encounter people in your common life who don't understand something, and you use philosophy to free them from that misunderstanding and to help them be more rooted in what's going on, right? So this is philosophy. So David Hume, in a sense, sees philosophy as having a role in the society like the bread maker, like the blacksmith. People talk about the sense maker. That is kind of what Hume is getting at. You are there as a certain sense maker and a certain self-defender. And if you cannot do that, you're going to be in trouble. And Hume, you could argue, has been proven all the more right by the internet, interconnectivity. Like what Hume is describing is needed all the more because your grandfather will be watching the news. Your friends will be. You are now always already in the slough of information. So Hume is warning about this just with like the beginning of interconnect, like flowing of information. He's a historian. Like he's kind of warning about this at the beginning of globalization, right? And he's just seeing that as intensifying. Well, yeah, it intensified. So you need philosophy more than ever before. Oh, by the way, you're already philosophical. This is Peter Berger. It's too late now. You're philosophical. We're all existentialists now, right? So David Hume is like, yeah, if you're a philosopher, you really need to have that return then, because if you're not, you're either in melancholia or resentment, or you're trying to return to a thoughtlessness to regain belonging that's not possible. All of that is pathological, and it's going to end up in some Lacanian register that gets us all killed. So you have to have the return to common life. Well, how do you return to common life? You have to commit to something. You have to make an absolute choice. You have to believe that these people have value, and they do. Because you don't know everything. Like, it's funny how we use uncertainty to deconstruct worldviews. Well, how are we so certain that common life people or people who don't like this sort of stuff have nothing that can gain us, nothing that is there? There's actually a lot to be said on that topic, but I'll throw it to Michael here. I also never got back to the Luber on all fake and therefore why do you care? Because I think what Mr. Luber is pointing to is the idea that if you care, someone made a fake AI picture of you, that says something more about you than about it. Right? So there's that kind of idea that it shouldn't bother you. I completely agree with that. The caveat would be, unfortunately, fake things do impact your life. Like money. You know money's just a social construct, right? Just See if that gets you out of your bills, right? Likewise, you can say AI pictures are fake. Yeah, but your boss saw them and you've lost your job. Oh, and also nobody knows what's true anymore because of deepfake videos, right? Like the social implications are a really big deal. Which then gets us into the question, I think actually, and this is a massive question that I was thinking about today. Everyone is now, and I'll throw it to Michael. Everyone now is saying stuff like, we no longer have a shared reality. We don't occupy the same facts. You know, we're in different worlds. So how can we have a nation if like nobody knows what's true anymore? There's a certain degree on one, you could argue that's actually a realization of what was always the case. We were actually always in different facts and different perspectives, and now it's just like AI is making us realize something that was always latent. There's a certain way in which AI has become a whipping boy for everything. There's another way in which the dangers of AI are very real, but there's another way in which we're just blaming AI for making us realize things about the human condition that were always latent that we didn't want to own. And so, you know, poor AI. But at the same time, it is like, yeah, people can use it for bioweapons. So there's real threats here. But I should stop. But the idea is that basically it's interesting to think that if we can't agree on the facts, I do think what's going to happen is more people are going to be hungry for the connections between ideas, the conversations themselves. Because your facts may be wrong, but the way you connected the things that you think are true, nevertheless, must be real because you just said them and they're in front of me, right? So there's something about connections that become more important. But if we're not careful, that's just in service of the problem of internally consistent systems and maps and different things. So how do we do that? It's another subject. I was thinking about that, but we never got to that. So Luber, if you're saying this, we didn't forget you, buddy. That's a really important subject. Hey, Michael. Let me throw it to Michael, and if anyone has anything else to say.
Oh, so many things, so many things. Where to start? So I've been listening to this really long but really amazing series on the French Revolution by the Rest is History Bros. It's like 3 seasons long. It's phenomenal. And I'm not even at the death of Louis yet, and it's like I'm like 10 episodes in. It's like really great. And I don't know why, but like when I learned about it in school, I was always really fascinated by it, and like more fascinated by it than the American Revolution. And now that I'm learning about it in a much more in-depth way, I can see all the reasons why. I think it was like one of the most monumental events in world history, certainly of the 18th century. But one of the things that I think ties into what you were talking about, Daniel, with the philosopher tyrant is in the last couple episodes they've talked about the rise of Robespierre. And what I found really interesting is Robespierre was actually one of the more like of the like Jacobin faction. He was actually one of the more like sane and pragmatic people. Like he was very scholarly. He was extremely well read and very inspired by like the Romans, people like Cato and Cicero. He was a very eloquent speaker, apparently, and very concerned with human rights, and kind of the direction France was going. And like, when France kind of as the monarchy was crumbling after like, Louis had fled, and there was like, they were in the process of regime change, and France and like everyone wanted to go to war with France, and like Louis and Marie Antoinette and like everyone were like, oh, war would be great for France. Like, it would like unite all of our people. Like, we hate the Austrian Empire. Like, let's go to war. Like Robespierre was like, wait, hold on. Like this, like he was basically foreshadowing the rise of Napoleon. Like he was like this war could very easily, create a tyrannical dictator, and the kind of fervor of war could very easily like just kind of become corrupted by this like hegemonic power. So he's like this like kind of like one sane sane appearing voice, and I'm not at the part yet where he becomes the next dictator and like the Great Terror, but like we all know like that's where it's heading. But what I found interesting is they were talking about him, and there was this other guy, I can't remember his name. I think it started with like a B or something, who was kind of one of the kind of foremost Jacobin members, and they butted heads a lot, basically because they both believed that they were the embodiment of virtue. And, they like both of them believed I stand for the people, like kind of this like holier than thou sentiment in the spirit of virtue. And they were making the argument, like Tom Holland and Dominic Sandbrook were making the argument that if that's the stance that you hold, like, and you have someone, else who believes that, like, both of you can't survive. Like, and it's kind of ironic because like virtue should be able to withstand pluralism, right? But if it comes from a place of um kind of egoic desire and this like belief in this like moral superiority, then it fractures it fractures relationship. And they were talking about how Robespierre basically had like no private life, like his entire world was devoted to politics, and how there's kind of like modern allegories to that. I think people who are like so like obsessed, and I've dated someone like this who like their whole life was the political, and without a grounding, and this goes back to like what we were talking about earlier with like the family, like without a grounding in relationship that humbles you, that is like the Jesus, like you're not a prophet in your own home, like you still have to do the dishes even if you're going out and saving the world. You still, you're reminded of your like fragility as a human, basically. And if that's not like an anchor to your philosophy, then yeah, someone as sane as Robespierre becomes Robespierre. And yeah, I think that's such a great case study. And for all of the problems and, you know, um, lack of fulfillment on the promises of the American Revolution with slavery and, women not being able to vote, and it basically just being a society for rich white men for about 100+ years. Like, I think there were moral, like genuine moral exemplars with Washington, with a lot of the founding fathers, that it just seemed like was not present in France, like at all. And I could go on, like I'm learning about the creation of the guillotine and how like like everyone was um oh, this is amazing, like we have something that's like a spectacular display of like a destruction of our enemies. And um by the way, side note, I learned the last public guillotine in France was 1939, and the last private guillotine was in 1977 after Star Wars came out, which just like blew my head off. But yeah, yeah, exactly. Just happened. But anyways, yeah, so I think this like return to public life is so vital. And that question, Ethan, you raised about how to do the personal when you have this like rich philosophical life as well. I'm right there with you, right there in the trenches with you. I think one kind of thing that I've gleaned is, like, I was just invited to a friend's potluck the other day, at the dorm we used to live, and it was just really great to reunite with people. And there was a point where this one of his friends had brought like all these instruments, and we're just jamming, like we were just singing like you know well-known songs together, and there are people on guitar and bongos and tambourines and stuff. And not once during that time was I thinking about, you know, I don't know, Heidegger or whatever, like like whatever I'm reading. Like it was just like a beautiful experience. And and so then that begs the question, is like, well, none of those people there are reading the stuff we're reading and they're having a great time. So like, do we even need philosophy if you can just find yourself enjoying moments like that? And yeah, I don't I don't know what to really say to that, other than it seems like philosophy is the preparation to be able to, like, not just find yourself in those moments, but like actively seek them out. And also, I think good philosophy knows how to step aside when I'm sure we all are like hyperverbal, hyper thinking people, and there are times where that just kind of needs take a back seat to the jam session, where you're just in the moment, right? Where you're just feeling the music. And so I think there's something about like like a humble philosophy that knows, or that is also able to transcend language, and kind of drop into that improvisational space that doesn't always need language. But anyways, I'll pass it back. I wasn't going to bring in the French Revolution today, but then Clayton mentioned Napoleon in the chat, and I was like, I gotta bring this in there and hear what someone's thoughts are on it. But
I mean, what conversation has not been made better by bringing in the French Revolution? So well done, sir. This has been delightful. I do fear I will have to go in a moment, but I've enjoyed this immensely. Ethan, I'm so glad you came today. I think all the questions that have come up are so critical. Actually, that example you just made gets at what we can describe. No, you don't need philosophy if you people are playing guitar and sitting on the porch and having a good time. You don't need it at all if people are going to dance clubs and all that different things. Here's the problem. People don't do that anymore. They don't develop the skills to play guitar unless they're going to be a professional musician. You can't go to your local dance club anymore. The loss of community, as Robert Potman says, is not there. So why did it go away? I would argue because people didn't have a philosophical answer to why do it if it won't make you money. So there was the logic of quantification at the expense of quality. So because people didn't have philosophy, they weren't able to defend learning skills to simply have hobbies because life is better without them. And now they're not able to have story time after dinner because they're under what Ivan Illich said is disablement. And now you need philosophy in order to actually gain yourself the confidence to go learn a skill that won't make you money, precisely so you can be a more dynamic human being and bring people together after dinner on the porch instead of just watching TV. Because if you don't develop a philosophical defense of learning skills that you don't get paid for, you won't do it. And so you won't be able to actually create community that doesn't need philosophy. This is the problem we have. You need philosophy now to do the things you need to create the conditions that bring people together without philosophy, because there is a pernicious metaphysics always in the background that is convincing you that doing some things is not worth doing, and so you don't do them because you're not able to mentally defend yourself against that, and you end up only able to consume, only able to watch Netflix, not able to play music because you didn't develop that skill because you weren't going to get paid to do it. And so you're not able to create those spaces. So this is the tension now, and this is what Hume is getting at. Increasingly, the things we need to have community that doesn't need philosophy needs philosophy to get them, because there is a philosophy of the zeitgeist that convinces you gaining those skills and doing those things are needed. Great example, going to church. How many people stopped going to church or being part of a religious community because they didn't have a defense of the faith? They weren't able to philosophically ground it, so they left. And now they're all freaking hikikomori. So in order to just stay, or doing Lions Club, or joining a bowling league, or all of these different things, why did communities stop investing in bowling leagues or communities building these things? Because it didn't make jobs, because it didn't increase the GDP, and they didn't have a philosophy or a argument against that way of thought. So it was, here's the key, rational to get rid of the bowling alley, rational to not develop the skills to play guitar, rational to not go to church. And so autonomous rationality led you to a world where now you need philosophy in order to get to that world where you don't need philosophy. That's the problem. And that's kind of the thing, because you need philosophy to avoid game theory problems, where everyone does what is rational and you end up in a suboptimal result. Okay, like you're describing it with the French word. So first, okay, I should go. Okay, so yeah, no, you don't need, you need philosophy to not need philosophy. That's the problem we have now. You need philosophy to not need philosophy, right? Like the world's not enchanted, okay? Like Charles says. So if you want to re-enchant it, you need philosophy in order to not need it. You have to go through philosophy. You have to go through the alienation. You have to go through the ability to, you have to be able to handle vast mental complexity in order to self-forget it. Like the only way you're going to enter flow states now is if you have the mental complexity to forget about your mental complexity. That's the problem. You can't in global pluralism get flow states, or I've frozen. Okay, you can't in global pluralism get self-forgetfulness or flow without going through philosophy. But here's the problem. Philosophy also takes you out of flow because it alienates you. So now you're thinking all the time, right? So in a way, thinking goes against self-forgetfulness and belonging and flow because you're thinking, so you're no longer flowing. But now you have to think to not think. You have to think to get into the flow. So you have to develop vast mental complexity so you can handle diversity, because diversity makes you question yourself and question everything you believe, right? So if you're not able to handle diversity, you're not going to have belonging or self-forgetfulness, because when you encounter otherness, you'll be taken out of it. And that's why everyone's returning to stuff like white nationalism, Christian nationalism, tribalizing with people that think like them, because if you can just be around people that think like you, the probability of getting snapped out of your self-forgetfulness goes down because you're not going to encounter radical difference that makes you question yourself. And so everyone isolates apart. They try to fragment, because all the people now that are doing this whole friggin' return to fascism, small nation states or whatever, they were ignored. They said humans need belonging. People need to feel like they have identity. Like the Nick Futuris, all those people, like the new, like Nick Ferrentes and all of that. People ignored them. Guess what, ladies and gentlemen? People do need belonging. And if you don't figure out how to give it to them, they're going to get it. And you're not going to like how they get it. Because people need to feel social cohesion. They need social intelligibility. But the problem is, thought threatens social intelligibility, and now the only way to social intelligibility is through that which threatens it. The only way to return home is through alienation. It's like Dante. You have to go through hell to get to heaven now. You can't go up the hill the she lions up. You got to go the long way. Yes, we have to go the long way. We have to return, right? And you see, the issue is we are no longer in a world where the average person learns how to play an instrument simply so after dinner you can have a good time. If you want to get back to the world where people storytelled, where people created spaces that made houses into homes, that made communities feel like communities versus a collection of random stores, then you must go through philosophy. You must go through that of which removed people from their belonging to return to belonging. So that's why we need philosophy, because that's the only way back. And it turns out that philosophy is in the business of beauty anyway. In the ability, philosophy is about actually having the kind of subjectivity that can encounter otherness without losing yourself. Like you're able to encounter the other without undergoing self-deconstruction, self-effacement, and auto-cannibalism. And that's when you get harmony. That's when you get music. Because when the piano can encounter the cello and not lose its crap, but actually say, hey, you're different, and because of that difference, we can make harmony, now you have something beautiful. And in fact, the complexity and the difference affords a certain beauty and harmony that in history was never before possible. So this moment in history, the vast difficulty of the possibility of harmony is precisely why the beauty of that harmony can be so great if we can rise to its challenge. And the only way to rise to its challenge now is to go through philosophy and to go through complexification. I think also I'll just say on to say on the French Revolution, what you're saying about there, this is so important. Everyone now with like AI is basically saying, but even if it's a danger, we have to make it, right? What you see in the French Revolution is that reason gets a life of its own. Like it gets a life of its own. And what David Hume is saying, if you don't return to common life, you can't bind reason in the non-rational. You have to bind it in something. And you see what ends up happening, good ideas, and Thomas Sowell talks about this all the time. You mentioned it. Good ideas, they're a problem because they're good ideas, right? Like a lot of the people, look, the people in the French Revolution, a lot of their grievances were 100% correct. They weren't making stuff up. Their grievances were completely correct. The problem is your good ideas to deal with grievances get a life of their own, and they kind of run away from you, right? That's the way people are talking about it. That's game theory, like game theory, the entire domain of game theory is a revelation of what reason always was. It was always this thing that is able to create situations where if you simply do what's reasonable, it gets away from you. You get a suboptimal result. You get a prisoner's dilemma. You get a multipolar trap. You get a Kenneth Arrow preferential problem, right? That's what you see in the French Revolution. David Hume is saying, without having game theory, like the only way to keep philosophy, ergo reason, from getting a life of its own and destroying us all is to bind it. And the only thing you can bind it in is a common life, something you commit to. Now, if you're not careful, this, though, runs into fascism, where everyone binds themselves to their small local state, and they're not able to deal with otherness. So we need to, basically, my giant thing with the sublation of human to Hegel and that into beauty and lack, it's a bigger issue, but there is a possibility, thinking in these all together, to have universal singularity, where people are singular and very different, and yet nevertheless in their difference able to socially relate. That's what we need today. What you're saying also, and I should have added this with Hume, as the philosopher ascends and becomes melancholic, the reason why this is extremely dire is because the tyrant can also feel like they're a suffering servant. They are disconnected, they're melancholic, so they're a suffering servant as a dictator, which means they're ethical. The ethical tyrant is the most destructive of all, because we've also made a massive mistake, like when we look at, because federalism in America is basically a kind of defense of common life while nevertheless having a union. Like you can look at the history of America as a debate of this problem between needing a common life to bind thought, but then what if they do slavery? Right? And this is why the American Civil War becomes central to the Belonging Again Project, part 950 or whatever, is that you have this issue that if you don't have federalism, then ideas get away and you create total war. And you could argue the American Civil War at the time was a philosophical war based on the notion of a general union, which was kind of based on Rousseau, you could say. It was a philosophical idea, and the Civil War was the bloodiest war in America, and it was incredibly bloody and murderous and was the birth of modern war. Modern war is philosophical war. Like, war now is fought for democracy, freedom, justice. David Hume warned about that. He said, once you have war be about philosophical notions versus resources, you're screwed because you can't bind it. Like, if I say go to war, hey, Michael, you want to join my war? I have to convince you you're going to benefit from the resources, the food. Like, you're going to benefit materially. But if I say go to war to fight for freedom or Christianity or whatever, then the whole world can be absorbed because ideas are not limited to any contingency. They can universalize, right? So Hume is concerned about total war. Right? The American Civil War is basically the birth of this notion because it's a moral war. And here's the critical thing. You can argue it genuinely was a moral war. Oh, wait. So here's a problem. You have real ethics that loosens itself from common life for a real ethical end that nevertheless gets a mind of its own you cannot stop. Right? So how do you take that all very seriously while also taking seriously what Hume is saying? We need a new binding principle. We need an in common life, such as you see in Friends. You need people who are relating with one another. Friendship, lack. The apathetic is the way you bind something without overly binding it, because you put a limit on it with the unknown, because it can't, but it's not top down. And the speech act itself is a way to bind without getting chaos, because anything can be said, but what is said has a certain necessity. Now I am getting incredibly vague and running out of time, but the debate on federalism, alienation is all very good. I've had a great time, everyone. Thank you so much. You're all great. Ethan, thank you for coming. Michael, Clayton, you all have a wonderful day. Thank you all. It's been a delight. Thank you, Ethan. Good to see you, sir.